My parents were both Irish, therefore, of course, I grew up in a sort of city that was used to sort of to welcoming people who were sort of here to sort of to invest in the future, and most particularly, of course, they were sort of required for their skills. So again, you know, that's the sort of the short history. So, or at least the sort of the history is that I've sort of worked in academia pretty much ever since, and can certainly sort of witness and attest to a lot of changes that have occurred in that time. And indeed, the sort of the whole nature of education, if I may reflect upon that just for a moment, has changed very dramatically. And again, I think we're nothing if the sort of the products of our upbringing and insights. But one of the things I do remember when I first started teaching at what was then the City of Birmingham Polytechnic, and just to be clear, I started as a part-time lecturer. So like most people, I'd have the day job. I've worked for the City Council at that point, strange enough, in the City Housing Department as was. But I used to sort of get there for 4:30, and the place was actually heaving with lots of students who were there for night courses. And slowly but surely, but of course, looking back on it, that declined to the point where they used to sort of shut the refectory at tea time, because of course there was no more demand. And of course, what that indicated, now in retrospect, was the sort of the widespread closure of lots of local companies who would send their people on part-time courses. So again, that as I say is an observation, but it's one which I sort of note. And if any government could address the ability to sort of make education something which is freely available, I know that there's a lot of money gone into sort of higher education, so I fully accept that, but in a way which of course makes it sort of accessible to people who sort of fall outside the system on their way through, that would be a good thing. But again, so coming back to sort of to my reflections, Birmingham, like the sort of region, was a sort of it was its whole heritage was in manufacturing, and of course what we've seen in the sort of the period that I've been sort of brought up from sort of the late 70s through the 80s, and of course many of you remember that the sort of the period of deindustrialization. That's had a sort of profound impact upon the region. We know quite clearly that COVID has had its impact, but very interestingly, just as another aside, the accountancy firm who do economic analysis, they all do. The Midlands, like all sort of regions, suffered. And in fact, London, strange enough, the southeast, probably unsurprised because of its sort of service sector basis, it suffered probably worse than sort of most regions. But of course, its recovery, as is always the case, has been far quicker. And the Midlands and the West Midlands in particular, and the sort of the Northwest are going to be slowest out of recovery. So that's one of the sort of the big issues. Now, of course, the sort of the headline stuff, and I'm not going to bore you with the statistics. Talking about the Midlands, it's such a mixed bag, because quite clearly, when we're talking about 4 million people covering the sort of the vast geographical area, there are bound to be sort of wide divergencies in terms of, sort of employment levels, deprivation, prosperity. So again, I'm not going to sort of get too much bogged down in that, but nonetheless, that it's nice to see Pat, who sort of joined us. I actually had the sort of the joy actually of going to Wolverhampton the other night. This was in advance of the sort of the Levelling Up report, and of course it's a while since I've been to Wolverhampton, but of course you can certainly see that a place which of course is in desperate need and sort of far more cash that will be available. Indeed, that's one of my criticisms of Levelling Up. But just as an aside, one of the big problems that we have in this region, of course, is the sort of the ability to move about with ease. If I tell you, from my door to sort of to where the venue was, it was 24 miles, and in the taxi it took, I think, by and large, about an hour and 30 minutes. It would have been quicker to go to London on the train, which is, it's kind of crazy. But again, in the sort of the wider perspective, the big challenges, as I see it, are the standards of the things which have been there for sort of so long. It's interesting, of course, that sort of the levelling up, whatever we may think about it, it's a grand concept, and of course it's good in intention, regardless of the fact that it's being wheeled as a very crude instrument at this moment. But all the things that are being said there have been well known for a generation or so, and probably longer. And quite clearly, when we're sort of talking about sort of the future of this region, of course, it will be through the sort of the people who come through the sort of schools and sort of the education facilities, of which I'm proud to be a part of. So beyond all of that, what do we say the sort of the future is? Well, I mean, certainly anybody who ever thinks there'll be a sort of return to sort of the mass manufacturing of the days of old, that sort of birds, it will never happen. There is a very sort of different future, I would guess, and indeed, having grown up in Birmingham and seen the way that Birmingham has changed its emphasis. I mean, you actually don't have to go that far back. In the very early 70s, if photographs were taken in the centre of Birmingham, you could actually see the factories in the background belching out all sort of the noxious fumes, which of course are part of the problem that we're still living with in terms of the climate and whatever else. And indeed, one of the sort of the other things which of course I would sort of point to is the sort of the poor funding in terms of sort of social services, and the sort of the attendant problems that come with sort of joblessness and hopelessness, and the sort of the health issues in particular. So I mean, I'm going to wrap it up at this point, because of course we'll probably talk about these in the sort of discussion, which is a sort of much more fruitful way of dealing with it. There are huge problems, and again, what I would sort of see is as I travel around the sort of Midlands, or as I increasingly sort of go back to traveling, which of course has been curtailed because of the pandemic, you see some areas that are sort of obviously very prosperous. Where I'm sitting, the sort of the southern edge of Birmingham, the next place along is Solihull. That's okay, although of course you go to North Solihull and it's a different ball game altogether. The difficulty I see for sort of all politicians, whether it be local or national, is that you can only do so much at a time, and I think that's the sort of the one big difficulty, that anybody who claims that they're going to sort of solve these problems in, as is being said, for instance, the other day, levelling up is going to be sort of sorted out by 2030, which actually, to be fair, it's not the sort of the intention, but those grandiose schemes, they rarely come to fruition. But the difficulty, the challenges still remain there. So you have to start somewhere, and of course, starting at the sort of the grassroots, it seems to me, is the sort of the place to do. And actually, as a sort of not in any way to sort of try and sort of sell it, but I mean, I was involved in editing a book, which actually Paul Forrest, who you all know very well, English regions after Brexit. And one of the sort of the big themes of that is, of course, that if you're going to do any of the things that need to be done, it is the sort of the return to sort of local sort of grassroots involvement. Another thing which I've sort of witnessed in my sort of lifetime, that sort of people become disillusioned with national politics, and particularly so, as we understand, for very good reasons, what we're seeing in Westminster. No disrespect, perhaps, at present. But also the sort of the fact that I don't think that people are sort of particularly interested in what goes on locally. It's a kind of mismatch, and so somehow or other you've got to get people involved in doing the sort of things which are important and taking responsibility for their local areas. Anyway, that's enough of what I've got to say. So I'll hand you back to Ash.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks for joining us, Pat. We've only just started just before you managed to get online. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to invite you, Pat, if that's okay, to kind of give us a bit of a background about yourself, and then obviously talk about some of the kind of national issues that we're looking at as we continue to start coming out of COVID and looking towards the future. So,
okay, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Well, look, it's nice to be with you tonight, and I'm sorry I was a bit late. I had one of those experiences trying to log on where your computer decides it wants to update, and you get that little whirly wheel for half an hour, and it got me thinking, what if other things that we rely on behaved like that? I mean, imagine jumping into your car, needing to go somewhere really urgently, and the car said, I'm sorry, you can't go anywhere. We're updating for the next half hour. Or you come home and you're really hungry, you really want something to eat, and you put something in the oven and your oven says, I'm sorry, I'm not cooking anything for half an hour because we're updating. But this is how these devices treat us, and we sort of accept it as normal. Anyway, that's my grumpy old man moment out of the way. Look, it's nice to be with you. I'll do a wee bit of personal introduction, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about what the Shadow Treasury team are doing. So I'm Pat McFadden. I'm the MP for Wolverhampton South East. I've been in the Labour Party a long, long time, since I was a boy. I was part of the New Labour Tony Blair operation. I was Deputy Chief of Staff at Number 10 and Political Secretary there over 2 different periods in the first 2 terms of that government. I've been MP here in Wolverhampton since 2005. I was a Minister for Business in the 3rd term of the Labour government. I served on the Treasury Committee for a few years. I was the Party's Europe spokesperson under Ed Miliband. In the Corbyn years, I was on the Brexit Committee most of the time. And now I've come back to the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Chief Secretary, working very closely with Rachel Reeves. So that's who I am. Let me talk to you a bit about the big issue, which is facing my constituents, and I'm sure people in Shrewsbury as well, which is this cost of living crisis, because this is the biggest economic issue facing us, and there's really a triple whammy going on. You have the energy price rise, which is, you know, nothing like anything we've seen for many years, with the announcement yesterday that bills are going to go up by an average of £700 a year, £693. And I've just spent some time on the doorsteps just before joining you in Springvale Ward here. People are just scratching their heads. I don't think it's really sunk in yet what this is going to mean for people. They sort of know it's coming, but they haven't quite envisaged it yet. The second thing is Tory tax rises. You have national insurance, you've got the freeze on personal allowances, and you've got certain assumptions built into how much the council tax rise will go up as well. And the Resolution Foundation found that taking all of that combined, you were looking at a hit to average household incomes of about £1,200 over the next year, which is a huge amount of money for people. And the third element in this is falling real wages. And the Bank of England yesterday described this as the biggest squeeze on net household incomes for 30 years. So this is very big, and I don't think anyone can be really sure what both the economic and the political effects of it are going to be. So what's Labour been saying about this? We saw this coming pretty early, and have been calling for a cut in VAT on energy bills since last year, since the big wholesale gas price really started to spike. But we were conscious over the Christmas and New Year period that we had to do more than just a VAT cut. So we put together a package which was announced early in the new year with three elements, really, 3 or 4 elements. Obviously, we keep the VAT cut. We spread the cost of the failure of the smaller energy companies that have gone bust over a period of years. We expand the warm homes discount, both to more people and more generously. And the overall effect of that would have been £200 off everybody's bill, but an extra £400 off the bills of the poorest households. And it's important that help is done in a progressive way, because the lower your income, the chances are the greater proportion of that income is going to be spent on energy. And there was a funding element in it too. We funded most of this from the extra VAT cuts, well, about half of it from the extra VAT receipts that the government's receiving because inflation is higher than expected. But we also put in a one-off windfall levy on the oil and gas companies that are making the most out of this. And we felt it was only fair to ask the companies that were making the most from the price spike to pay something towards the relief of the customers who were suffering the most from it. And let me just give you an example of why I think that's justified. Yesterday, Shell announced their annual results, and it contained a profit of $20 billion. It's 4 times the profit of the previous year. And the chief executive said it was a momentous year for them. And he set out plans of how they were going to use this bounty in share buybacks and extra dividends and so on. And his counterpart at BP described the current energy market as quote unquote a cash machine for his company. So we felt that some sort of one-off levy, which had been done in the past by George Osborne and by Gordon Brown, would be a justifiable part of the package. I want to compare that now to what was announced yesterday by the Chancellor. What you got for everybody was a loan. He's called it a rebate, but it's a loan. It's your own money. What he's basically doing is saying, I will give you a loan of £200, whether you want it or not. And you will pay that back on your bills at £40 a year for the next 5 years. And that's why we called it a buy now, pay later solution to this. So rather than a real package of relief, he's simply giving customers a loan and asking them to pay the cost over 5 years. And the big assumption, of course, built into that is that prices will go down in future years. They may not. What will he do then? The second part of his proposal was £150 off council tax. Now, people will welcome that if they benefit from it, but we feel that the Warm Homes discount, which is based on your income, is a much better way to target help for the poorest than just through the council tax. Because you do have the phenomenon of, depending on where you are in the country, some better off people living in lower band houses, and also some people who don't have very much money living in bigger houses. So we don't think the targeting of that is best done either. And the overall effect is even if you get help from the Tories on both of these counts, the most you'll get is £350 on their plan. Whereas for the poorest under Labour's plan, you would get £600. So we feel our plan is fairer, it's better costed, and it's funded in a fairer way. And that's just indicative of the approach that the Shadow Treasury team is taking. And what they really want to do with this cost of living crisis is blame it all on external factors. They want to say this is all global, all the inflation, all the energy costs and so on. And there are global factors. Of course, there are other countries experiencing inflation. It would be wrong not to recognise that, and we do. But it's not all global. And we've left ourselves more vulnerable to this by having very little gas storage. The facility at Rough was allowed to fall away, which took away about half the country's gas storage. We had a very badly regulated market where a lot of smaller companies had no capital for when things got rough. Does that sound familiar? For those of you who remember the financial crisis? Indeed it is. And the cost of all of them falling over is quite considerable. And there's also no plan really from the government for the future as to how we decrease our reliance on energy spot markets, or indeed insulate our homes better. And so the plan that we announced at conference about a big forward-looking plan for energy efficiency, retrofitting in buildings and so on is in the longer term a big part of this too. So that's where we are on the biggest issue of the day. Just before finishing, there might be one or two other things just to mention. We're very conscious in the Shadow Treasury team that whatever individual policy we're talking about, the test that Labour has to pass is to be trusted with people's money. can people trust us with their money? That's an essential test of leadership, just as much as can they trust us with the defence of the realm. And these are tests that, quite candidly, we failed in recent years. And if you don't pass those tests, people don't look that closely at your policies because they've made a prior judgment about you. And you might have some great policies and you might not, but it won't really be about your policies. You have to pass those two tests to be considered as a serious party of government. Now, I'll leave the defence of the realm one to other people in the shadow cabinet and other people in the party, although I've got my own views about that too. But we're very much charged with that first test I mentioned about being trusted with people's money. So when we come out with a policy like the cost of living one, we try to be really clear how it's going to be funded and how we're going to raise the money. Because if we don't pass that prior test, it's very, very difficult to win. And the other element that we brought into this discussion around taxation and spending and so on is economic growth. The UK's economic growth since Labour left office has been pretty anemic. Even if you take the financial crisis into account, we ran an average growth rate in our government years of 2.3%. Since we left office, it's been about 1.8%. And this is like compound interest. Losing 0.5% of growth every year adds up to quite a lot after a decade in terms of how wealthy your economy is. So if we want the country to be more prosperous and we want the households within it to be more prosperous, we need to get growth up. And that's why Rachel Reeves made quite an important speech on economic growth a couple of weeks ago. And that's why we've been saying that one of the reasons the Tories have become so high on taxation is because they've been so low on growth. And low growth year on year leads to much bigger pressure in taxation terms. So we are going to be very focused on how to get the growth rate of the country up in the future, because that's a big part of how prosperous we will be. Ash, I'm going to stop there. You've got other speakers, you've probably got questions and so on, but hopefully that's helpful in setting out where we are on cost of living right now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pat. So now I'm going to invite Councillor Julia Buckley, the new leader of Shropshire Labour Group, to kind of talk about what both Stephen and Pat have talked about and what that actually means for Shropshire, and how we go from there. Julia?
So I'm Julia Buckley, for those who don't know me. I was elected this May 21, representing Bridge North West on Shropshire Council. And then this month, I've just taken over as the leader of the Shropshire Labour Group at the Unitary Authority. And really, you know, hearing the description about the situation of the region and the situation for the country, and we heard about how it's disproportionately affecting our lowest wages and our lowest paid households. That's really the story of our everyday life in Shropshire, that because of our rural situation, we're already disproportionately affected. So our residents are so sparsely spread across the county. We are the second largest county in England, so over 3,000 square miles. And what we have is, you know, we are 4 times as depopulated as any other county. So everything costs more, you know, everything is spread out. So if you think about the ingredients of a strong economy, you might have education opportunities, skills, you might have critical mass of supply chains, you might have mobility, you might have investment. Well, now imagine spreading that like jam as far apart as you possibly could over thousands of miles. And that's our situation really in Shropshire, in that it's very difficult then to build an economy in that situation. And although we do have some manufacturing like the rest of the Midlands, and we have got some excellent growth economies, and we're really hopeful about the opportunities around the green economy. So I hope that we will come on to talk about that a bit more, because there's a potential role for Shropshire. The downside is that is tempered by our sort of traditional reliance on the agricultural economy and tourism. So it has that kind of stifling effect on our productivity. And it basically means that although we are quite highly qualified and we have quite good skills levels across Shropshire compared, for example, in Wolverhampton, the Black Country's got that massive skills gap. We're actually one of the lowest wage regions. So Shropshire, we have low wages and low productivity. So we're starting from this position where we've all got to pay more to get from A to B. and we're paid less. That's before we've started with this current crisis in the cost of living. So if we're going to talk about who's disproportionately affected, I think it's our rural residents. We're already starting at a low base and we're being hit on every possible side. So for example, the Shropshire Council, currently run by the Tories, are preparing the maximum council tax rise that they can throw at residents, so 3.99%. In their own statement, they say 97% of residents will pay more for less. So they're going to have the maximum increase, and they're also going to be subjected to £10.5 million of cuts across services. And they're proud of it because they've had to scrabble this together with hardly any funding from central government. So that funding, you know, is not being spread out to the rural areas, and we're constantly trying to make the case for fairer funding. And just as we were sort of waiting for everyone to arrive, there was a bit of a background chatter about, you know, the announcements around levelling up funding, about why Shropshire failed again to secure any funding for the second time, and that one of the responses is that we should think about joining forces with Telford and Wrekin and thinking about devolution. And I was trying to make the case that actually that might not be such a terrible thing, because those urban concentrated, those Met authorities who have got one closed centre, it's cheaper to run their services. And so actually for us to cross-subsidise, it might be a lot quicker for us to get some cash that way than to try and get some kind of rural criteria into any kind of funding distribution. So what else happens in Shropshire? We are obviously older. We have an ageing population. On average, we are 9 years older than our urban neighbours, but that also trickles through into the economy. So in the last 10 years, the number of over 60-year-olds who are economically active has doubled, and the number of over 70-year-olds who are economically active has gone up by 13%. So we've got this situation where we're at low wage, we're getting ever older, that we don't have a skills gap in the same way that the Black Country and perhaps Birmingham has, but what we have is skills in the wrong places. Because everything is so spread out, it's really difficult to find the right person with the right skill and also have them in the right part of the county. So we've really been hampered by some of those things. And I hope we're going to talk about some of the problems that have come out, not just from the pandemic, but from these global pressures on cost of living, but also some of those opportunities, because starting from a low base where we've been hampered by a lot of rural challenges, we really see a glimmer of hope for Shropshire. You know, 38% of organisations and businesses want to carry on with their staff working from home. We've more than tripled the superfast broadband in Shropshire over the last 10 years. So the possibility to use that digital connectivity to join up what was otherwise a really fragmented and dispersed workforce, we see that as an opportunity for us potentially to drive up our productivity and make those sort of steps forward, but certainly in the creativity and in some of those manufacturing industries. So I'm hoping, especially if we can get some crumbs, if we ever get a Labour government and we get some crumbs of investment around the green economy. I know in Labour's sort of regional manifesto, there is this idea to push forward another 5,000 jobs in the green sector in Shropshire, because we have a lot of those assets. So although we're currently starting from a low base and we will be disproportionately affected by these crises, I do see that glimmer of hope ahead about what could be better for Shropshire. And our group are, as we speak over this weekend, we're preparing our alternative budget, and we'll be presenting that to the residents of Shropshire about how a Labour council would do things very differently, not be investing in vanity projects, new buildings for councillors and roads that we don't need, but actually reinvesting back into some more of our climate neutral projects, which could spread that investment across the county. I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions that we've got. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julia. So we've got some questions coming in, and the first question I've got is for you, Pat, and it's from Jim, and that one is, can you explain how the proposal to reduce council tax to subsidise rising energy prices is going to work? Will the reduction in council tax be made up by the government, or are councils expected to kind of absorb yet another cut?
Right. I had a message that said the host is not allowing people to unmute themselves, but I managed it. I'm not sure of the details, Jim, of how this will work in terms of the administration of it. I believe it's going to be through the local authorities. Having watched the Chancellor's press conference last night, he said he was more attracted to this than the warm homes discount because of speed, because councils had all the, obviously they've got all the property information of who pays what council tax and at what band they're paying it in any particular local authority. So from that, I take it that it's going to be administered through the councils themselves. But I have to confess, I've been out and about in the constituency all day, and I haven't sat and worked this through, so I don't have any more detail than that.
Brilliant.
It's bands. It's only given to houses in bands A to D.
That's right. It's only houses in bands A to D.
Yeah, and as I understand it, it's government money, but hey, it's our money, which is we get to keep this lot.
As well as some wag said when asked what he was going to spend his council tax rebate on, he said, "I think I'll spend it on the increase in my council tax." So there we go.
Thank you. I've got another question, and it is, and I'll start with you, Stephen, if that's okay. So what policies or kind of ideologies would characterise a local economy that supported and benefited both the young and the old?
Right. I mean, that's quite a difficult question. I mean, again, coming back to sort of the idea of localism, I think that sort of people know on the ground what they need. And when we talk about the Midlands, it's such a sort of mixed bag of I mean, again, as Julie was talking about, up in sort of Shropshire, it's a very sort of rural economy and quite clearly still being affected by the sort of the impact of Brexit, and that will continue for many years to come. So who knows? The one thing I would hope with the Labour government, they might address the question of, well, okay, yeah, we know that sort of we're never going to rejoin the EU. Well, we will, but not for a long time. But I think that different arrangements. I think the sort of the key to success is it's the sort of the skills base, making sort of sure that sort of people who or kids that leave school are as equipped with the skills that are going to be sort of required in the future. Again, I talked about in my sort of introduction, you know, going back into sort of the 80s, that sort of the Polytechnic where I started teaching, it was local people on local courses for the things that were needed at that time. Our economy is very different now, and yeah, the simple answer is do what is required, but whatever you think is going to be the future, it's probably going to be different again. So it's very much a sort of moving feast. I mean, the bottom line is that we can't sort of do without sort of money and huge amounts of it. I mean, the other thing, when you sort of look at the stats, which was having glancing over this afternoon, you know, the disparity and the amount of poverty is very notable. Again, particularly in sort of Pat's area up in Wolverhampton. And you know, again, I think that sort of what goes to that is the sense of sort of hopelessness, or the sort of the poverty of aspiration, somehow breaking that cycle. Because you know, just because you're born in a background that makes you poor, it doesn't mean to say, of course, your intelligence levels are any less. So you know, that there are indeed huge challenges.
Fantastic, thanks. Pat, have you got any thoughts about?
Well, I'm just thinking about what Steve said there about Wolverhampton and Julia mentioning levelling up and so on. It's been quite interesting as a Wolverhampton MP in the last couple of years, because the government has visited, you know, ministers have visited us a lot, and they talk about Wolverhampton a lot in their announcements and so on. And I think a sort of fair scorecard on this would be, we know the long-term problems of the industrial closures that happened here some decades ago, the environmental difficulties that's left in terms of contaminated land and derelict sites and so on. But you can't leap straight from the long term just to the last 2 years. You know, you would expect me to say this, but things got better in the Labour years. We had Sure Start centres in many parts of the city. We had neighbourhood policing teams in every part of the city. We had an RDA trying to bring investment into the area. We had good investment in our schools. The public realm definitely improved. And then we had 10 years where our libraries were closed, our local services were cut to the bone, the Sure Starts closed, we lost the neighbourhood policing teams, and so on and so forth. And now we have these individual pots of money. And look, I'll always, as a local MP, welcome new investment or any new jobs in the city. But it's only fair to put this in the context of what's been lost over the last 10 or 12 years. And not for nothing did Lisa and Andy describe this as like somebody taking a tenner from you and giving you a fiver back. You might be glad of the fiver, but it doesn't feel like a great bargain overall. So that's where I sort of feel that we are with that right now.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think there's an enormous gap between the rhetoric and what's really being offered. Sorry, just to make a final point, as they talk about King's Cross style redevelopment. I don't know how many people here have visited King's Cross in the last couple of years. 3 billion was invested into King's Cross, and it has been transformed. It's completely amazing as an urban environment, but it's 3 billion in the space of about a square mile. Now, if you take the rhetoric that says you're going to do that to the rest of the country, and then you've got no real substantial new funding for it, there's just an enormous gap between the rhetoric and what they're really promising. I'll stop there, sorry.
Brilliant, thank you. Julie, I'll come to you next. I don't know whether you caught the question or not, because I know you dropped out. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet, I think the kids are on Netflix and it's conflicting with my own activities. Just a couple of things then. One is about, we touched on the levelling up funding. You know, our local Tory MPs are demanding a meeting with Gove to explain to our council leader what we need to do to get some money. And although they're talking about devolution, we know what we would need to do to get some money. We need to be a red wall seat. So I'm delighted fact that I think one of the Wolverhampton constituencies is getting some money for digital, but Shropshire really are taken for granted, because until they lost North Shropshire recently, they know that this feudal area will always vote Tory and they don't need to give us any crumbs. So I'm not really holding out much hope that under tier 2 we'll get any money for any of our projects under that particular scheme. But just going back to the question about what is the thing that would make the most difference, and I heard Steve's answer around skills and education, and I just want to talk about what we call the A-level tax in rural areas. So that business about everything being dispersed and not having access to anything, educational facilities for post-16, so skills, colleges, access to courses is a prime example. And you talked, Steve, when you were younger about how you noticed the trends between numbers coming and tapering off. Well, what we notice is that they just closed down colleges. So there is no college facility in Bridgnorth anymore. That's the town I represent, 12,000 people, and several others have closed down. Everything centralised, so we've got this thousand.
Oh, I think we might have lost. Oh. Are you back, Julia, or have we lost you? No, I think we might have lost Julia. Okay, I'll move on to.
Sorry.
Oh no, you're back.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. See, this is the consequence of living in a rural area. Our broadband is terrible. I'm just saying that people, you know, there is no education locally and people have to get buses. The buses have been reduced, in many cases cut completely. And so in order to get a bus to access an educational facility, 16 and 17-year-olds have to pay in the region of £500 to £600 a year. We call that the A-level tax. If you're wealthy enough that you can pay that, as well as your child not earning money, you then are, you know, you win the lottery of life. You now get some skills. But I've met young people, a young girl, for example, who was 17, working in a hairdresser's in Broseley. And I said, did you always want to be a hairdresser? She said, no, but we couldn't afford for me to go to college to do anything else. And if I work here, they'll help me get my qualification while I work. And a whole generation of youngsters in rural areas have not had their potential maximised because they simply cannot access the skills that they need to unlock what they could contribute. But then our businesses can't get the people with the skills in the right place. So it's exactly right around that investment to unlock and to help us get over this economic crisis. But we need to have some different strategies so that we're not concentrating all this investment in this square mile in one part of the country and everybody else on the periphery, you know, we're just left hung out to dry. So we do need to think about some different strategies.
Brilliant.
And one point I'd like to make is that a really good comparison would be what happened in Germany after reunification. And on average, the West Germans, as were They spend something like £70 billion a year, and the consequences that sort of many former East German cities are now sort of more productive in many different ways, and it depends how you measure these things, than sort of a lot of our northern cities. So it can be done, but it takes huge amounts of money, as we know.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I've got another question that's just popped in. So Pat talked about failing and winning the argument on trust, but this is not just about what we're doing or proposing. It's about getting our message out. There is money available, but the government are just misusing it. I read about tax cuts in the banking sector that is equivalent to the NI hike. The NHS write-offs could fund Shropshire's future fit twice over. The government is spending more than we are asking for, but just giving it to their mates. Is there any way that we can kind of, what would Labour do, Pat, to kind of address that?
The issue of fraud and waste and misuse of money is something we've really been working hard on. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, which we actually had an opposition day debate on this week on Tuesday. If you take the COVID spending, now everybody knows there was pressure to get money out the door and pressure to get help to businesses and individuals. And let's be honest, a lot of what the government did really did help people in terms of furlough and business grants and so on. But there was a lot subject to fraud as well, and they were warned about this. It is possible to go quickly and still guard yourself against fraud. And so on the 12th of January, they published a thing on the government website saying that they only expected to get back 1.5 billion of the 5.8 that they think has been lost to fraud. Do the math, and that leaves 4.3. So 4.3, they've said they don't expect to get back, certainly any time in the next few years. And so we've really highlighted that. If you want a couple of rough examples, 4.3 billion is about the same as the whole education catch-up programme. It's about half the policing budget for England and Wales, and so on. We then find that there's 8.7 billion in the Department of Health's report, which has been written off on PPE costs, which can't be used for one reason or another, or the equipment was faulty. Some of that was about the prices paid, but other parts of it were just bad contracts or stuff that's gone out of date. And that takes us to some of the cronyism we've seen. And if you want to know what you could do with 8.7 billion, well, I've said, that would be pretty close to the annual policing budget for England and Wales. It's about twice the hospital building project budget. And so there is fraud and waste. And in terms of cuts to the wrong people, it is true that, for example, a company like Amazon will benefit from the super deduction. Do they need to benefit from the super deduction? On the banking front, there was a banking surcharge that has been reduced as a sort of compensation measure for corporation tax going up. So I think when I look at how the Tories manage public money, they cloak themselves in this rhetoric of sound money and the only people who can run things. But I think there's a complacency, if not an arrogance, coming in the way that they do manage it. And we're very much onto this on the Shadow Treasury team, and that's why we had an opposition day debate devoted entirely to it on Tuesday of this week.
Fantastic, thank you. I can see people that have got their hands up, but unfortunately I can't see who's got their hands up. So if you could pop your questions in the chat, and then I'll get to them in sort of order. Julia, on a local level, how do you kind of view some of the waste?
Well, there's two aspects, isn't there? Yeah, one is before I was an elected councillor. I worked for Wolverhampton City Council for 20 years, and I was a European funding officer, so writing bids to draw down funding from the EU. And a lot of people that I worked with were very frustrated at how far ahead we had to plan, up to 7 years ahead, how cautious everything was, how everything had to be planned to the nth degree, because it was a protection against fraud. And that was exactly the red tape and the bureaucracy that everybody was so angry about and was so desperate to leave the EU so that we could manage our own finances. Well, guess what? If you don't have procurement processes in place, if you're not robust in your due diligence, if you don't plan ahead, then you open yourself up to fraud. And so actually the cost of planning and being careful is significantly less than the cost of not doing that. So what I do hope is, after all this episode is over and we move, or if we ever get the replacement for EU funding, which was supposed to have been in place by now, I hope that some lessons have actually been learnt and that we will put back in some of those protective measures. We'll never see that funding again. And this particular government, that is their style in every funding that they release. There is no plan, there is no forward planning. Everything is announcements are today and you must spend the money by tomorrow, and they don't really care whether you deliver what's promised on the tin. And that's quite scary, because that is public money. You know, that is taxpayers' contribution, which they are wasting without any plan at all. But what I find interesting is that it's exactly mirrored at Shropshire Council level. So, you know, 97% of taxpayers are paying more and getting less, but 3% are going to get something more. So same old story, that their friends and their cronies will see investment. We'll see a huge investment in Oswestry Innovation Parks, where all the cabinet members of the Tory Friends live. And that's the only town outside of Shrewsbury that will get any investment. And then 19.8 million will be a contribution towards a road, a 3-mile stretch of road in the northwest of Shrewsbury, which the majority of residents do not want. And Labour's alternative budget will be to pull that vanity project and to spend 1/20th, 1.2 million on road safety measures across the whole county. 20 is plenty. So I think it's about an attitude, isn't it? It's about a mindset of planning, forward planning into the future, not short-term quick gimmicks, but that long-term planning, that road safety, 20 is plenty, and investment now would save costs on both health and environmental costs long into the future. But it's also about understanding that as representatives, we've got to represent the whole range of people, not just the 2 or 3 who are our mates. And I think that we see that arrogance and that complacency at every level with these Conservatives, and I think it's going to be their undoing.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephen, is there anything you want to add on?
Well, all you can say is welcome to post-Brexit Britain, that they want to get rid of all the sort of bureaucracy and rules, and this is the impact. That I mean, I have to also say, it's, you know, sometimes I used to talk to students. You can talk about these big numbers, but yeah, when I was growing up, I remember that there used to be sort of headlines as someone won the pools and won £1 million. That was a fortune. And you know, let's face it, it is a fortune. £1 million in cash would be wonderful. But remember that $1 billion is 1,000 times. And again, winning the pools 1,000 times over. You know, these are mind-boggling sort of sums of money. And again, you know, when the shake-up eventually comes, I think Julia's absolutely right, it hopefully will be that downcoming. But of course, they'll all have sort of disappeared, and it'll be to sort of, you know, their mates will have sort of done well out of this. But, you know, that's what really stinks about this, is that sort of, it was all very well, if I may get a bit angry about this, you know, we clapped our hands on a sort of Thursday night, but, you know, the problems are still there and will continue to be there. How we sort of move on from that, well, you know, therein lies the problem.
Brilliant, thank you. I think hopefully we're going to be able to bring some of the audience in now. Thanks for popping all your questions in the chat, but hopefully Jordan's found the right button so we can bring people in. So we've got a question from Richard Fitzgerald, if you want to come in.
Thank you all for organising this. And it's a question primarily for Pat. The Brexit queues that have increased over the past month because of the extra red tape will get worse in May and in the summer because of the phytosanitary checks, and in the autumn because of the biometric checks. These undoubtedly are going to add to the cost of living, and they're also going to cause delays and problems with supply chains, which are going to drag on growth.
Oh, Richard?
Yes?
Just 1 second. I think we might have lost Pat.
No, I'm back.
Oh, you're back. There we go.
Right. All right.
That's all right. Carry on, Richard. Sorry.
So these Brexit queues are going to affect the cost of living, but they're also going to affect growth because they're going to affect supply chains. And in the same way that Labour has had excellent suggestions in terms of ways to mitigate the energy costs, what suggestions is Labour thinking about to mitigate the Brexit queues, and how and when does it propose to make that case?
Well, I can't make the consequences of leaving the single market and the European Union, the customs union, go away. There's no, and I've got to be honest with you. Look, on the overall Brexit thing, I was very much a Remainer in quite a Brexity constituency here in Wolverhampton, and we lost that battle, and we're going to go into the next election accepting that we've left the European Union. Now, there might be some things that we can do, on the financial services front. We have said that we want to try and get greater market access for our companies, but a lot of this paperwork and queues is a result of leaving the single market and customs union. And I can't write the manifesto here tonight, but to be honest, I think there's been nothing the Tories would like better than to fight the next election saying Labour will take you back into the EU, and we can't put the country through all that again. And some of this, I'm afraid, is just the consequences of the deal that was signed. So there is going to be more bureaucracy. It is. Julia talked about the Brussels red tape and all of that. There used to be a saying in Brussels about regulation. It's not one in, one out. It's 1 in, 27 out, or 28 out. But we chose to leave that system, whether I liked it or not, whether, I don't know how different people in the Common have different views. And so I think increased bureaucracy is part of our post-Brexit future, I'm afraid. There may be some things we can do, but I can't pretend to you that I can make it go back like it was, because I don't think that's happening in anybody's sort of foreseeable timescale.
Stephen, I'll come to you. I see you've got quite an extensive background in terms of Brexit, haven't you? Are there any thoughts or anything you can share?
It certainly kept us busy over the last couple of years. Yeah, I mean, Pat's absolutely right. I fully accept the fact that that ship has sailed for the time being, and perhaps we sort of have to get used to sort of the pain. Maybe sometime in the future, a different generation will come along, and I accept it's a really toxic question. And if anything, it's going to get worse. It's really difficult. Again, the issue is that what the government are able to do is to claim that all the economic portents look good. And you look at something like employment, or the reduction in unemployment. But of course, what we see are many of the jobs are pretty poor. Again, I've talked about this. In the good old days, you could start at the bottom and work your way through. A lot of the organisations have been hollowed out, so you start at the bottom and stay at the bottom. And of course, as we know, a good percentage of those jobs are 0-hour contracts. I mean, again, the thing is, there, as we know, that was subject to European protection. We've addressed that issue. I'd like to think that there may be a future where there will be lots of high quality jobs. But the difficulty always is that the by what means. It requires huge investment, and of course, as we know, many of the companies that are involved in investment, they're pretty footloose. They invest for a while and then disappear when, of course, the going gets tough. What's that expression? That they want to take the profits and socialize the losses. It's a we win, you lose scenario, and it really is. It's a difficult one. Again, coming back to the queues. I mean, I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet. I think it will get progressively more problematic, and particularly, of course, as we can see the negotiations and the relationships between the EU particularly with regards to sort of the Northern Ireland Protocol, I can see that one going pear-shaped yet again.
Fantastic, thank you. Julie, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I won't make any bones about it. I cried when we left the EU, 20 years of my professional life and £35 million of funding into deprived communities in Wolverhampton, and predictably that was the end. But what's interesting is that I think if it hadn't been for COVID, we would have felt many of these consequences of Brexit much sooner, and there's been a bit of a fog over our departure of the EU. So first of all, lots of people didn't realise that the transition meant we hadn't left, so they thought we'd left and they didn't feel any different. Then we actually left, but because COVID came along, everything stopped anyway, and we were just in a limbo. So it's only really now that as restrictions are lifting, we're beyond transition. We're hopefully the economy is moving beyond COVID. People are actually starting to see and feel what those consequences of Brexit are. And I think it's interesting that obviously this government will pretend it's nothing to do with Brexit and blame it on anything else. But I think people are feeling it and they're beginning to understand for themselves. And in terms of what we can do about it, we can't do anything about the vote, and we can't do anything about the natural consequences of that vote, which is additional paperwork, not enough missing skills. We've got huge gaps, haven't we, in the NHS and truck drivers. But I think it will have that gradual effect on people's consciousness. I remember during the Brexit campaign trying to have conversations with people about it. And they were very emotional. They didn't really want to have a theoretical, abstract discussion about the legalistic pros and cons of the EU. And I think people's lived experience has a much stronger value than any theoretical argument that we can make. And I will be completely honest that my ultimate dream, that is in about 10 years' time, there is a general move amongst businesses and ordinary people that say, actually, we don't want to be in the EU, but we'd quite like to have something that Norway's got. We'd quite like to have those sort of business benefits. Can we just be in the customs union? Can we just have the economic bit without any politics? And I think, and I wish and regret that the Labour Party couldn't have been a bit sexier in selling an economic Brexit, saying, okay, you don't like the politics, but please don't throw away the economics. And actually, it was that failure to reach a compromise, which means we've ended up with this. So I hope that in the long run, that will be the long-term solution. But the medium-term solution, I think, is around diversification of our economy. So all those businesses that are now crumbling and folding around export, they will have to move into different areas. And actually, talking again about those opportunities, the opportunity, and it's another question coming up, for us to invest in our own green energy would solve so many of those problems. It solves that reliance on countries that we've fallen out with. It reduces our reliance on countries that might be at war, and investing in our own skills and our own economies like green energy and other sectors. It means a massive restructuring of our economy and a diversification from what we have known, but we might as well do it because a lot of what we have known isn't going to work for some time now.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Councillor Elizabeth Roberts. Are you there?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
There we go.
I mentioned that schools in Shrewsbury get less per pupil than many other areas in the UK. Our child and adolescent mental health service has taken a 40% cut in the last 2 years, with our children's mental health drastically deteriorating. The monies that were fraudulently obtained could be directed at our children because they are the ones in this county that are really struggling. We've currently got secondary schools now having to provide tea as well as breakfast for our children. How would Labour improve our children's services, because they are at breaking point now?
Thank you. Julie, I'll come to you first for the local view, and then Pat, I'll come to you for a national view, if that's okay.
So what the Shropshire Conservative administration will tell you is that 78% of the budget is already spent on adult social care before they had to do anything else. And so even with the massive council tax increase, they're just covering mandatory services. And they'll tell you there is no money left in the budget for any discretionary, so any optional services. In other words, they're doing the minimum because their friends in central government won't give them any cash. And they will say that this, children's mental health and support for schools, they will say that that is discretionary and that is not a legally mandatory service like planning, that has a regulatory service that has to be delivered. But I'll tell you what is interesting, and we see it a little bit at national, but we really see it at local. Tories struggling with these tight budgets won't do the right thing for the right reason, but they sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reason. And what I mean is this, that looked after kids, looked after children, so children in residential care are the most expensive item on any council bill. A Labour government put in a huge troubled families programme to invest in families and help them improve their lives and sort of get to the bottom of the underlying issues that would obviously save money for everybody for as far into the future as you could see. The Tories dismantled that because they wanted to save a few quid. Finally, somebody who has got some kind of understanding of finances beyond the end of this week has helped them understand the cheapest way to solve the problem of looked after children is to have early intervention and invest up front. Yeah. And so actually now they're putting back into place lots of upfront support for families to help them before the children go into care. So in the end, they've kind of gone full circle. They've realised that it's better to help people when it is cheaper to do so. And I think your example will end up in the same category. It would actually be cheaper for the government to help families who are struggling on the breadline to feed to their families, because if they don't, what happens to that family is so much worse. Then it becomes a mental health problem, then there are physical health problems, and then the family disintegrates, and they could also end up in care. So that brainchild, the Conservative brainchild who gave them some hard facts, some home truths about long-term financing, needs to shine a light on children's mental health and say investing now could save money in the future. Labour would do it to save lives. The Tories might just do it to save money. And when we're making the case and arguing with them, we need to explain this to them, help them understand some basic maths.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Nothing to add, Ash. I mean, I think Julia's answered it very well.
Brilliant, thank you. Okie dokie. Anything from you, Stephen?
No, I mean it's beyond my sort of area of knowledge, but I absolutely accept the sort of the point that early intervention, it saves money later. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if we go then to Ben Wood, please.
Cheers, Ash. So going back to the government's levelling up paper, one of the policies in the paper is that every region, should have a mega city in, I think, 20 years or so. And the idea behind this is that will kind of act as a catalyst for growth for the wider region, which I suppose for us means investing in Birmingham as a kind of catalyst for growth in Shropshire. And my question to the panelists is, do you three kind of accept this notion that the way to create growth in towns like ours is to invest in cities, or do we need a more kind of town-centric model?
Thank you. Stephen, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, I remember when Michael Heseltine, who I've sort of met on a number of occasions, he launched a thing, No Stone Unturned, which you may remember. It's about 10 years ago. Anyway, and what I do remember about that event was that there was a comparison between Germany and this country. And what was absolutely fascinating about Germany, anybody who's ever been there is always amazed at the way it operates. And again, it's the sort of the lander system, sort of the regionalisation. But of course, it was the sort of the economic output. In fact, I'm using my hand here to demonstrate this, of all the sort of the regional cities were broadly equal. You know, that okay, some were higher than others, but not by much. Then, of course, you look at sort of this country, and there's no doubt about, London's, way ahead, followed by, Manchester or Birmingham. I mean, it's interesting that the aspect of sort of, what you do in Birmingham will have an impact in Shropshire. The difficulty is it's an hour away by car, not much less by train. And the train is okay, but it could be an awful lot better. I have to say, and again, I may be somewhat heretical with this, the vast amounts of money, and who knows what the cost of HS2 will be. You know, that would be far better being sort of distributed for better connections between towns. But you know, coming back to sort of the crux of the question, it's a really difficult one. How are you going to sort of to make these towns and cities? And again, there's so much in the sort of the levelling up that, you know, it would take a while to sort of work your way through it. I have to say, less people sort of not realise this. A lot of the sort of the metrics are sort of measuring the effectiveness. They were effectively filtered from the sort of the industrial strategy, which of course was introduced under Labour. So you know, it's and in fact, I saw a report yesterday. There were bits of it that was actually filtered from Wikipedia. So it's a sort of classic sort of sin, as it were. It's a kind of mess. I mean, it's not to say that that's required. Look, the idea of sort of mega cities, I'm tempted to say, well, so what? I mean, and the difficulty I also have with HS2 is I think there's a great danger in turning Birmingham into a suburb of London. But of course, that is another question. But yeah, I mean, levelling up, great in theory, but you know, so I always like to quote the sort of the great Dr. Deming, who was the sort of the quality guru that was sent to Japan. He was fond of saying, well, okay, by what means? And of course, that is the sort of the challenge. By what means is this going to occur?
Fantastic, thanks. Pat, I'll come to you next.
Thanks, Ben. It's very nice to see you again. If you're going to steal something, don't steal it from Wikipedia, is my starting advice. I'm not sure the answer to the question you posed, Ben. I think it's a really good one. Instinctively, I'm quite uncomfortable about the sort of politics that sets one area against another. And one of the things I think about the whole levelling up thing is this notion that suddenly, and I say this as a West Midlands MP, suddenly London's bad and everywhere else is good. I just don't, I don't react warmly to that. I think the fact that Steve is absolutely right when he compares us to Germany and says one of the differences is we've got this big global city and Germany doesn't have a big global city. That's what we have. And you might, if you were designing the UK from scratch, not do it like that, but that's what we have, and it's a great strength in many ways. So I don't really like that everybody against London thing. And equally, like I have to tread very carefully here in the Black Country, where Birmingham's our big neighbour next door. But I think, you know, this notion of the Black Country against Birmingham, by the same token, I suspect we do better when Birmingham's doing well. And the whole West Midlands, I'm talking about the conurbation here rather than maybe the wider region, when that's doing well. Maybe that's just my political upbringing. I don't even like this stuff about red walls and blue walls, to be honest. I think in the last election, Labour had an everywhere problem, and it needs an everywhere answer that brings the country together rather than dividing people into walls. Near where they live. So that's not an answer based in urban theory, Ben, but it's based in my own instincts.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you've probably got more chance of the Tories finding all those missing billions than dealing with the Black Country Birmingham issue. Being from the Black Country, let's just not go there. Julia, anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I'm originally from Yorkshire. And lived in Wolves, and now I live here in Shropshire. So I think I've always lived in places that get forgotten and feel neglected. And so the one thing that I would say is that it is a positive acknowledgement that some areas have got left behind. You know, that is something that Labour should have recognised sooner, and that we all need to solve that. You know, that the mismatch between where problems are and where funding flowed, that does need looking at. I don't think the Tories have got the right answer to it, but it's really important that the conversation is about that, because that does exist. And the idea about the megacities, I was laughing a bit because 20 years ago in local government, we were all talking about city regions, which is a region, you know, spiraling out of one city. Guess what? It's the same idea, but it was Labour at the time. And I think that Pat McFadden is right. If I think about to when I was living in and working in Wolverhampton, when Birmingham did well, there was a trickle-down effect. effect for the immediate neighbours. I can't see how there would ever be a trickle-down effect from Birmingham to Bridge North. There is a train station in Bridge North. It's a steam train. There is no way to get from Birmingham to Bridge North by train or bike. You have to have a car and you have to drive for at least an hour down some dark country lanes. So trickle down doesn't work for everywhere. And we talked earlier about the A-level tax. It doesn't work for young people. It doesn't work for people who can't afford transport. It really doesn't work when you cut buses. So yes, I think it does work where you've got those neighbours, where you've got close by towns and they're close enough to feel the benefit. But I think really what's needed, and it's back to diversification, is that each area has got its own strengths. And it's about that investment in the different strengths of different areas. So Birmingham's, you know, this young, vibrant, the youngest city in Europe. And it's all about, you know, the creativity and the economy there. And out in rural Shropshire, it's all about tourism and it's all about the environment. We need to be investing in different things in different areas and saying, you know, Shropshire's good for this and Wolves is good for that and Worcester's good for this. We don't all need to be the same. We don't all need the same kind of money at the same time for the same things, but we mustn't go back to forgetting and neglecting any pockets of the country where that deprivation is allowed to fester, because then we lose whole generations and it's then so difficult to turn those areas back around. And you know, we've got Ben Wood here on the call tonight. It's great to see you, Ben. And when we were knocking doors in North Shropshire, we were speaking to people who haven't ever voted. They said, I don't vote because they are completely lost from politics. You know, it was Tory for 200 years. So they quite astutely had realised their vote was completely worthless. And it's those kind of forgotten areas where nobody has ever cared what it does to their mentality. It takes a lot to change that around. So I think of all of the fluff around levelling up, at last somebody is talking about areas that got forgotten, and let's hope they're not forgotten in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got a few more questions in the chat. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'll take the ones that we've got in the chat and then I think we'll leave it there for this evening. I think we could be talking into the wee hours of the morning if we don't. So the next question is from Catriona.
Hi, this is particularly for Pat. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Pat, you talked about Labour having to pass the test of running an economy and actually persuading people that we're capable of doing that. And I was kind of wanting you to say a bit more. You know, how will Labour do that? How important, for example, do you think having, you know, distinctive economic policies is going to be? Well, economic in the broadest sense, really, because I think that is one thing that in the last few years under the previous leadership that we did have policies and they were different and they were distinctive. And, you know, I'm very keen that we get to that position again so that people actually feel that we are a different party and we have something very different to offer. Thanks.
Okay, Pat?
Yeah, Katrina, and we did have a great difference, and I'm afraid it's impossible for me not to point out that it ended up with the worst election result since 1935. And I look around my city, and I'm the only red in the village. And I look at West Bromwich, and there are Tory MPs there. I look to the south of me in Dudley, where in the election when I first became an MP, we won every seat in the borough, and they'd mostly got 5-figure Tory majorities. So when I talk about passing the test of trust, I'm very, very serious about it. I don't want another result like that. And that's what we got to do. Now, you asked me how we'll do it. It's not a flick of a switch. This is a tough thing to do. Labour's been behind on the economy in polls since 2007. And we have lost 4 general elections since then. And I suggest to you that these two things might be linked. So we've got to take this very, very seriously. For our side, It means, and I gave you the example of the energy package. When we produce something, we take care to say how we're funding it. And that helps to meet that test. I think it also means being able to say no as well as yes. And if you say yes to every spending demand and every pressure group that asks you for money, in the end, that's not radical. It's not radical. Anybody can say yes. So we've got to be able to say no as well as yes. And the public have to see us being able to say no as well as yes. And the third element to this would be what I talked about getting behind this notion that the Tories put forward that they're the only people that can run the economy. So exposing their waste and profligacy and the susceptibility to fraud that we talked about is a really important part of this, because their rhetoric they use like a shield to cover some of the mistakes that they have. But if we can get behind that and actually make them pay the political price that they should pay for some of the waste and profligacy, as well as convincing the electorate that we can actually be trusted to run things, then we may be in with a chance. If we don't pass the prior test of trust with the economy, it won't matter much what our policies are, because the electorate won't get there. They'll have made a prior judgment, just as they did in 2019. So we do have to have a different approach from then if we're going to be electorally competitive at the next election. And we've made some starts. Very important to communicate to the public that we're a changed party from the one that was rejected so emphatically in 2019. Whether they've heard the message clearly enough yet, I'm not sure. We have made a start on that, but there's more work to do in that direction.
Brilliant, thank you. Just briefly, Julie, do you think that's something that's replicated on a local level, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that I feel. One is the double standards. So the Tories are not held to the same standard that Labour representatives are. So, you know, oh, there's always excuses why they got away with it, and yet Labour are held and scrutinised within the nth degree, and it doesn't feel fair, that disparity. So it's almost as though we have to be better than the Conservatives to be given that fair chance that Pat's talking about. But the other thing is that it's very difficult for us as Labour members, because I do think that we live in an echo chamber. So what satisfies our members or our supporters doesn't have the same resonance and credibility with the voters that we need to win over in order to win a majority. And so we have to spend some time to move out of the echo chamber to understand how it used to be Middle England, but I guess now it's Red Wall. We need to understand how those voters think and feel and what it is that would satisfy them. And we need to try harder at that. And if you are interested, I like to listen to what the enemy is thinking. And I can really recommend a podcast by The Spectator called Coffee House Shots. I don't know if anybody else listens to this, but in the election when I was a candidate, I listened to it every day. And it is Tories who write for Tories talking about Tory policy and talking about what Labour are doing wrong. And it is fascinating to hear how they think and what they think about us, because they talk about it amongst themselves, and then the next day you see that's what the Tories are doing in government. So if you want to move out of your echo chamber, we need collectively to understand how other people think differently and what it is we have to do to reach this doubly high bar before we will be accepted, because we are not treated like for like. If we did exactly the same as the Conservatives, we will be rejected. We have to be twice as good in order to get in. That's not to say we can't do it, but we just need to be prepared to put the work in.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to move on now, and I've got a question from Joe about the Bank of England.
Yes, there's different interpretations of what's driving this inflation currently. The Bank of England seems to have taken a stance that it's a monetary issue, with them taking an increasingly hawkish approach, recently raising interest rates. And today, Andrew Bailey, the governor, asked workers to not demand pay rises. What's Labour's interpretation of what's driving this inflation and what to do about it?
Pat, I think we'll come to you first.
Well, it's the bank's job, and the job was given to the bank by the Labour government when we made the bank independent in 1997, 98. Clearly, a number of countries are experiencing inflationary pressures. There's an enormous debate going on within central banks, between central banks, among people outside as to whether this is transitory or whether it is longer term inflation. Now, those who believe it's longer term think that's a stronger case for interest rates rising. Now they've gone up twice in 2 monetary policy committees for the first time, I think, since 2004. They nearly voted to increase them by 0.5% yesterday, I believe. There was only one vote in it to keep it to 0.25%. And there are others who say you shouldn't respond to this kind of inflation in the same way as inflation in the past, because of different factors behind this, and it's more of a supply problem than an excess demand problem. So there's a huge debate around this. I expect that the bank will increase rates again, because if inflation is going to reach 7%, that's so far beyond our target that they probably will do that. The markets certainly expect another couple of interest rate rises this year. I don't know if that's right or not, but I would suspect that yesterday's isn't the last one. And that is the tool that they have in their locker to do it. And that's the system that we established. And most central banks now have an inflation target as their anchor. Central bankers talk about looking through the data if they think that inflation's just a kind of a bump rather than a longer term thing. I think the judgment they've made about this is that it's not really a bump, it's more longer term, which is why you've seen interest rates go up here and go up in some other countries in the world. But one thing I learned in some years on the Treasury Select Committee is it's not really wise to speculate too far in the future about what a central bank will do.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to come on now to something I think that's really acutely affecting Shropshire in terms of the NHS. And I know over Christmas, some of the stories that we were hearing of people waiting outside 8 or 9 hours, sometimes longer, in ambulances, just waiting to get into A&E. So I'm not sure who this question has come from, but the question is, the NHS seems to be starved of funding to create a situation in which it fails. As it fails, the reason for its privatisation becomes more justifiable, using the Conservative dogma. What's Labour's view? And I'll come to you first, Julia, if that's okay, to give that local view.
Yeah, well, I am going to say that it's always worse for rural areas, because our population is spread. So we rely on ambulances far more than in Wolverhampton or Birmingham in order to get our population, our elderly population, from the side of the Clee Hill into Shrewsbury. So when SAF, our Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust, when they cut the funding, so they deliberately do not fund enough ambulances to ever meet the target set by NHS England. When they do that, everybody knows there are multiple consequences. Obviously, if the ambulance doesn't arrive within the golden hour, there's impact on life and loss of life. But what it means is, with the cut to beds and the cut to staffing on triage, just as you've described, Ash, if you're lucky enough to get an ambulance after a couple of hours and you've been driven for an hour and a half across country lanes to get to the hospital, you're then having to wait outside for several hours, which is blocking that ambulance. So ambulance is being used effectively like rural beds while we wait for triage, which takes them off the road, which is adding to the waiting time. So yes, there are lots of different problems around the NHS, and for rural areas, the centralisation budget, this unit cost per population head, is really hammering us, but it all comes down to funding. Even if we had the funding level we had from 10 years ago, we would be feeling so much more secure, even with COVID, around managing on a day-to-day basis. And mismanagement comes into it as well, the amount of money that is wasted on agency staff. And those staff then have no experience on the departments they're sent to. They're sent to a different ward every day. So there is no institutional memory. There is no knowledge of the processes per ward, and there's no knowledge of the patient's care. So to save a few quid per hour and not have to pay people their holidays, the cost to the service is exponential. It's another one of those, isn't it, where cost up front, investment up front would save later. So I agree, it's a cynical trap by the Tories to erode the service. And I think everybody on this call will have a friend or a family member who has said to you in tears, I cannot wait any longer for my operation, I am going private. And what do you say to that person? Do you tell them that they should suffer or they should not have their therapy to save their life because you know that the system can't fulfill them? I tell them this is not how it should be, but that doesn't change how it is. So I agree with Pat. The thing we need to do very quickly is establish the credibility to win government so that we can very quickly put it right. And if we miss that opportunity in 2 years' time, if we're stuck in opposition for another 7 years, there is very little chance that the NHS can survive beyond that.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephen, I'll come to you next.
Very interestingly, another document that sort of came out, and of course there was a flurry of this sort of stuff in last week, the benefits of Brexit, and they were pointing out the sort of the funding was going to go up in the sort of the for the NHS. But of course, once you start looking at sort of the fact that they've not done it in real terms, it's actually a cut. So that's the sort of the reality. Of course, it's going to get sort of tougher. And of course, what we're possibly going to see when the time is right is increased privatization. And indeed, I think the sort of the thing about sort of American outfits coming over here and selling their services, that'll be back on the agenda at some point. It'll be seen as the sort of the magic bullet that's going to solve all the problems. So I mean, it's not without sort of note that in the sort of opening ceremony for the Olympics, which was 10 years ago in London, the NHS was one of the jewels, as it were, that was celebrated. Boy, oh boy, it's looking a bit tarnished. Not for sort of the efforts of the people involved. I've got people who work in the NHS on the front line, and they've been up against it for the last 2 years. It's a battle zone. And what is it? We've got sort of 5-6 million people on the waiting list. It's going to take years to solve that, even if with the resources that they've got. So big problem.
Brilliant, Pat.
This will be the last word for me, Ash. I'll have to leave in a minute. But look, it really pains me to see what's happened to the NHS. When we left office in 2010, it had the highest levels of satisfaction on record. We had really done the hard work to bring waiting times down. We got a lot of criticism, sometimes from within some of the professions, for having tough targets on these things, like the 4-hour target in A&E and the 18 weeks from diagnosis to treatment. But my goodness, the improvements brought by driving those targets through the system compared to what we've seen since, where people are waiting longer, there are more people waiting, where the social care system's been so denuded that even when people are admitted to hospital and they're clinically free to leave, very often there's a sort of block because you can't get a proper social care package for them coming out the other end of the hospital. And all of this, even leaving the huge COVID shock aside, is putting big strain on the system. So, the combination, the winning combination before was both investment and reform. And that's what you've got to do. And one thing that COVID may have taught us is actually technology can play a bigger role than it has in the past, and that can help us. And we should be thinking of things that can reform, that help to get these waiting times down, faster diagnostics and so on. But we've got to see it as one system, the health and social care system, because seeing it as two systems and really not taking care of both of them properly has left us in the position that we're in with it right now. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go, Ash, and say goodbye at this point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your
very
time.
much. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too, and I wish you all the best.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pat.
Bye, Pat. See you again.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good place to kind of bring this discussion to an end. I'm conscious that there are still some more questions, and there's quite a few comments in there as well, but we'll definitely capture those, and it's something we can revisit in the coming weeks and months. So what I'd like to do is I'd just like to ask Stephen and Julia just to, if there's anything else that they'd like to just say as we come to an end. Stephen first.
Well, I'll ask Julia to.
Such a gentleman.
Well,
Well, I think, we've heard lots of different challenges tonight, haven't we? And, although the title of this talk was about post-pandemic, we're hearing that quite a lot of the issues and challenges that we face economically are not really because of the pandemic, are they? They're because areas have been forgotten. They're because of chronic underfunding from the Conservatives, whether it's the NHS or whether it's education. And we've heard about how in rural areas we've been completely, we're so dispersed and so rurally spread out that we have an additional challenge, and we've been behind for a long time in terms of funding and access and getting our economy moving. And I think we need to take the opportunities that we now find ourselves faced with. We have an opportunity now with not just a fresh Labour team, and you can hear, I think, a lot of optimism from Pat about the sort of government ready almost, aren't they, when he's talking about opposition away days, and we've got this policy and strategy. There's a real sense that they're gearing up, aren't they, as a government in waiting. And as you know, we're now 10 points ahead in the polls, and in some red wall seats we're 12 points ahead in the polls. And I have to tell you that on Shropshire Council at the moment, the Tories have their smallest ever majority. There is a gap of 10 seats between the Tories and all the opposition. So we're confident at the next local elections, if each of the opposition parties win 1 or 2 seats, so if 5 seats fall, we'll be taking control. So for me, there's a real sense of opportunity now that the Tories' policies have been seen to fail, and people haven't just seen and heard about them, people are feeling the terrible consequences of that failure. And I think that will move people to act differently and vote differently and give us the opportunity to try and put some of this right. And I hope that other people feel the same, that it's been quite an optimistic evening, that we're hearing about lots of plans, lots of policies, that we do have ideas about how we can do this differently, and that perhaps we're now at a turning point where we won't be having disappointing results, but we can see a way forward. So it's grim now, but I think that we are over the hump in terms of that credibility and that opportunity to try and put some of this right. I see that ahead of us.
Brilliant, thank you. Stephen?
Okay, well, very quickly, I said the last comment, it talks about the sort of the fact, this is from Alan Herbert, that COVID has taught us there is money available when there's a crisis. I mean, we've been through what's equivalent to a war. And indeed, the idea was suddenly going to have to sort of repay it. It's just nonsensical. The Second World War, it took sort of decades. I think turning sort of something which I see as being problematic, sort of the issue of sort of how levelling done, into a positive, if that's seen as a sort of a grand strategy that we can all buy into, and make this country sort of great. And I don't mean that in a sort of that petty nationalistic way. It is. It's a wonderful place to sort of to live and to sort of to bring up children, and let's return to sort of things that sort of made this a good place to be, and certainly sort of attracted my parents to sort of come 1950s. But of course, what we've got to try and do is to sort of salve the wounds that have been left by what. I'm not even sort of mention it, and bring ourselves together. And that is the sort of the key issue. I think Pat is absolutely right. It's a matter of sort of being trusted in the eyes of those who sort of feel left behind and forgotten.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on the call this evening. We have invited Angela Rayner to join us in April for our next Shrewsbury Focus. So fingers crossed, we'll be able to come out with the date for that in the not too distant future, and hopefully we can all be in the same room at that point. But thanks again to Julia and to Stephen and to everyone that's joined us, and we'll see you again soon.
Great.
Thanks very much, Ash. Very, very well organised. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye, Steve.
Bye, Julia.